Hello guys, and today we will talk about the great Russian culture, especially from this modern war perspective. I think this conversation can continue in the future videos because actually there are a lot of aspects we can discuss in detail. But let us start with a general question that I have to all of you. When talking about your cultures, French, English, Danish, do you describe them always with an attribute great? Have you heard of an American speaking about, their literature, constantly saying the great American literature, the great American literature? No. Of course, such phrases exist, but they are pretty rare when talking about some masterpieces and in a specific context. But every Russian, even those who never read, always describe their literature, their cinema, their television, anything as great. It is inseparable from the way they want to represent Russian culture. Okay, this speaks about this existing fascism inside Russia, but why do many repeat this phrase after Russians without questioning? And quite often in the comments below my videos where I share more information about this modern Russia, I come across comments of good people who support Ukraine, who see Russian war crimes, but say it's so difficult to understand this because of the great Russian culture. Last year I was proud to show you a documentary that we filmed for Ukrainian public television Suspilne, Great Russian Lies. These are 6 series and I attached the list because they are dubbed in English now about Russian propaganda in different spheres. And if you want to look in detail with, lots of videos and photos proving a lot of important aspects how Russia uses literature, sport, music, media to spread their false narratives, do watch these videos. But let's talk here about this concentrated aspects that distort your understanding of the not so great Russian culture, especially if you look at the people that it nurtures. Because I believe that one of the main tasks of the national culture is to shape the people, to make them good representatives of the nation, kind, tolerant, respectable, patient, and that is definitely not about the modern Russian army. Remember to join the community of this very sincere channel. I love chatting with you. And please let us make this a dialogue. Share the videos, like them, but also in comments below, give me your personal associations with the Russian culture. Don't be afraid, I'm a Ukrainian, but I'm an adequate Ukrainian and I won't judge you if you will tell me the things that you personally love about that culture, but you can only say it if you have experienced that. Because another interesting aspect, I have come across a lot of conversations, comments that people love, Dostoyevsky, Tolstoy, Tchaikovsky, but when you start talking with them about these authors, about these composers, they know nothing, and it turns out they even didn't read their works. They simply got under the influence of the great Russian culture, great Russian literature concept. So first of all, stop thinking of it as great, think as normal, like all cultures worth our attention, and let's try and analyze what is wrong with the way people, learn from this culture and how Russians actually use it now to explain to their population and to try to manipulate the global opinion about some core historical events, or for example even the recent wars that they've started in Chechnya, in Georgia, and this very big war in Ukraine. So literature is perhaps my favorite area of culture. I love reading and I read a lot. And to tell you the truth, Russian literature was a big part of my school program. So when talking about Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, I do have my arguments because I've actually read them. To tell you the truth, I never loved their text as much as I loved, for example, texts of Latin American writers like Garcia Marquez or Vargas Llosa, and I didn't have that many French, English, Mexican authors. Even in times of the independent Ukraine, the Russian influence was very strong. And I can say that half of the books that we had to read at school were by Russian authors. So you have to understand that this distribution, translation, popularity of the Russian writers is not a fully organic process, but a state-funded policy that began in times of the Russian Empire, continued in times of Soviet Union, and now is preserved in the Russian Federation. They invest millions and billions in, making their authors popular and known. So, for example, your country may not have enough money, may not have enough programs to popularize someone of your authors, but Russia will invest in that. Specifically, if these authors try to whiten Russian imperial character. And that is another important aspect that very few talk about. Look, when we analyze Russian literature of the 19th century, and let's be honest, there are not many great works in the 21st, and we don't know much about Russian literature before St. Petersburg was built by Ukrainians and inhabited by Europeans. So all of these works, all of these authors mainly represent an imperial mindset, and they try to manipulate your opinion, describing everything to the east of Germany as Russia. No Czechia, no Poland, no Ukraine, just big Russia. Because most of these works were created in the 19th century when Russia acquired 50 miles or something of new territory per day. A problem that many of you think about is that classical empires have their lands overseas. Russia expanded in a different way, destroying, swallowing other cultures around it, and pretending they never existed, and including in the books that later were translated and given in hands of your grandparents, parents, and now you take it as a reality. Another important aspect that those very popular now authors that you may have heard about, like Pushkin or Dostoyevsky, they were supporters of many Russian war campaigns and actually genocides. Pushkin was so popular because he was also supported by Tsar's court, and whenever Russia began an invasion, Pushkin glorified it, and his poem was translated in 50 different languages the very next morning. Not a very typical editorial behavior of the 19th century, because the Tsar invested in that, because they wanted to shape the opinion of your great-great-grandparents that will later think like that, and you will inherit that mindset that after Germany you only have big Russia, when it is not true. An interesting fact, Pushkin, who did not see anything good about Ukraine, who spoke only bad about our Cossacks and hetmans and so on, and any dream of the Ukrainian independence, and he actually spoke about the need to kill Ukrainians, to kill Georgians. Such phrases are in his poems. But there are so many monuments of Pushkin all over the Soviet Union. And when we were working on that documentary, The Big Russian Lies, I was surprised to learn that most of Pushkin's monuments are not in Russia, but in Ukraine and Georgia, the countries that wanted to break free. And that is actually the way Russians mark their territory. If Pushkin is there, then it is the Russian Empire. It's not about one monument or two, it's about thousands. We had thousands of monuments of Pushkin, a poet who hated Ukraine and never visited Ukraine. Why? We never had that many Ukrainian monuments of our heroes. So this definitely demonstrates it's a kind of propaganda that they used. Another important aspect that I consider is very interesting. Many of you tell me that you come from the countries that were once empires or were colonies. That is a dark part of the history of our planet. But there is a tremendous difference between your empires, let's say the British or the Austro-Hungarian, and the Russian Empire. In your history books, in your media, in your modern films, in your school programs, you describe that imperial period as something negative when analyzing the attitudes to the colonized people. You may speak about good things, important events, but when you speak about some suppression of the rights of other colonies or something like that, you take the responsibility and you say it was not good. Not just that, many countries like France actually have special programs for these colonies to boost their democratic experiences, to return them back to their cultural practices. It is just like work on mistakes. Okay, you were a harsh empire, but now you're not. And Russia does the contrary. Russia glorifies its imperial past, and Russia says that it was the best period, and now we want to return back to that stage. We need to punish our colonies. We need to teach Ukrainians. We need to teach Georgians. We need to teach the Balts that they belong to Russia. They are Russians. That is what Putin says officially. That is what their schools tell to the children. And that is, by the way, a great danger for the generations to live in my part of the world. Because they intoxicate people and they give them these poems. And they said, don't worry, you can go and eliminate that nation. Because Pushkin, he's a famous poet. His monuments are everywhere. You've learned him in school all the time. So he said that was okay. And here we come to the recent moment that actually inspired my conversation with you today. I often think about this misunderstanding, but I was interviewing Anastasia Alexei, who led the project where they collected the inscriptions, the graffitis of Russian invaders that they found on the newly liberated territories that were briefly occupied by Russian soldiers at the very beginning of the invasion. They were looting our homes, they were leaving dirt, they were behaving like that term that YouTube will not let me use because of the policies. So anyway, they left a lot of inscriptions, and many of them were filled with hatred. And they described how happy they are to destroy all of that. They demonstrated jealousy, saying like, oh, you were so lucky, writing that, for example, on the wall of a child's bedroom that looks good, something that their children in those miserable peripheral areas of the unnaturally vast Russian Federation will never experience. So they expressed that hatred on the walls together with the quotes from the Russian literature that allowed such crimes. So what they do, contrary to your countries that once were empires, they do not analyze, they do not re-evaluate, but they actually make it worse with, drones, artificial intelligence, and decades, if not centuries, of the Russian propaganda. They use it to excuse themselves, like we are doing what Pushkin said was okay, what Dostoyevsky said was okay. By the way, an interesting fact, I don't know if you've heard about that, but Dostoyevsky was the favorite writer of Goebbels. And you know that is one of the main criminals of Nazi regime. That is why with like Russian classical literature glorifies the imperial violence. But the dissolution process has already started. Trust me, I'm not exaggerating. Watch the video, which explains a lot and also makes you feel calmer about the very fact that this empire will soon collapse, because that's natural. They do not survive in the 21st century. And here I have another question to you. When you think about Russian culture, even if you like Russian culture, even if you describe it as great Russian culture, what do you think about? Perhaps writers, painters, composers who all lived when? In the 19th century? In the early 20th century? Can you give me any superstars of the Russian culture, I mean global, that you like naturally, not because they give you this information, they give you this content, but you've chosen them, you've discovered them? Any 21st century composers, any 21st century best-selling global writers, interesting to global public, to Japanese, to Italians, to, I don't know, South Africans, Australians? Can you give me such an example? Because I have never heard of such. Russia desperately wants to return to its past. It's perhaps the only country, maybe North Korea, and of course Iran, by the way, that want to live in the past. By the way, their ally China doesn't want that. They want to live in the future. And Russia wants back to the past. They realize they are not competitive. And they are not competitive not only in the sphere of, IT technologies or even military equipment, but they are not competitive even in the cultural sphere, in literature, in music. And you know why? Because real creativity needs what? Freedom. Real creativity needs freedom. And Russia does not know what freedom is. They have forgotten this word. They don't know its real meaning. They have never tasted it. People under constant Russian attacks in Ukraine are 1,000, 1,000,000% more free than an ordinary Russian somewhere far from the front lines with no military objects visited by Ukrainian drones. And such people cannot create masterpieces because they are not free. Their mind is not free. Let me know what things impress you about the Russian culture. Share any observations, because I learn from you, and that's useful in my thinking, in my videos, in my dialogues with you, in my understanding of this world. But if you keep saying great Russian culture, then keep saying great French culture, great Ukrainian culture, great German culture, because all of us then are great. And my personal conclusion that I keep repeating in that documentary, that I keep repeating in my videos, is that you evaluate, that you measure culture by the people it nurtures. And in Russia, we witness them as looters, rapers, and murderers. In Ukraine, as people who do not want to learn anything new, who deny the beauty and diversity of this world. So perhaps there is some inherently wrong with the great Russian culture. And if you want to know more why they keep calling rotting West, decaying, rotting West, but still send their children to your cities, check this video on the channel, and remember to subscribe if you're new. I'm always very honored and happy when I see how our community grows. Follow me on social media, the links to which you can find in the description of this video. Thank you for buying me coffees, becoming patrons and sponsors of this channel. That's an honor. Slava Ukraini!